Hello and welcome to this video presentation. How do I set up Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2016 to work with Azure SQL? In this video, I will demonstrate the steps involved in moving a standard Cronus database onto an Azure SQL instance, and will subsequently access it using an on-premise NAV web client. These are the steps we will be following. First, we will upload the Dynamics NAV SQL Server database into the Azure SQL Database Server. After that, we will configure the NAV service tier, which is running in an Azure VM, to use the uploaded Azure SQL database. I will also access the newly uploaded NAV Azure SQL database from a web client on my laptop to demonstrate how it works. It is important that the NAV middle tier is installed in the same Azure location as the NAV Azure SQL database so that you can get the best performance for the required traffic between these two components. The starting point for this video is an existing installation of Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2016, which is using an on-premise version of Microsoft SQL Server for the NAV database. All NAV components exist on a single virtual machine in Azure. If you would like to follow these steps on your own Azure VM, you can very easily install a NAV demo environment using the Dynamics NAV 2016 image, which is available in the Azure Gallery. When the machine is built, you can simply run the cdemo Azure SQL install.ps1 PowerShell script and answer the prompts to configure NAV for your requirements. The first step for our demonstration is to create an Azure SQL database instance to host our Dynamics NAV database. You can do this in the Azure portal by selecting the SQL database menu item and then the servers option like this. Click on the link to create a SQL database server and provide the login name, password, and region you want to use with this SQL database server. Then click on the checkbox to start the process of creating a new Azure SQL database server in your subscription. After a moment, the process will complete and your SQL database server will be created with a system-generated name as shown here. At this stage, it is a good idea to establish the connection string for your Azure SQL database instance. To do this, we will click on the instance name like this, and then select the dashboard option. I can then select the instance name as shown here. I can then paste that into Notepad and append the value database.windows.net to get the full connection string for my instance of the Azure SQL database. So my connection string is z29umkukn7.database.windows.net, and I will keep careful note of this as it will be used later. The next step is to log into the SQL Server machine where you have your current NAV database installed. In my case, it is an Azure VM. Then start the SQL Server Management Studio and try to connect to the new instance of Azure SQL Database Server. I need to provide the connection string and the login name and password I used when creating my Azure SQL Database instance. If you are connecting from outside Azure, you will get the following error when you click Connect. You get this error because your new instance of the Azure SQL Database Server has been secured so that only machines you specify by IP address can access it from outside Azure. As we are doing this exercise from a VM inside Azure, we will not see this error and can skip to the next step. However, if you do encounter this error message, the solution is simple. You need to configure your IP address within the Azure SQL Database instance so that it is permitted access. So take note of the IP address in the error message and then go to the Azure portal to add this to the SQL Database instance. Click on the SQL Database instance name as shown here and then click on Configure. In the configuration page, you can add IP addresses for all machines which will need to access your Azure SQL database instance. If the target IP address is shown in the field Current Client IP Address, then you can simply click on the arrow titled Add to the Allowed IP Addresses, as shown. Once you have added the IP address, then click on the Save icon at the bottom of the page. After saving this change, you should now be able to connect to your Azure SQL database instance from SQL Server Management Studio in your NAV environment without getting the error which was shown at the last attempt. Please note that I'm using SQL Server 2014 SP1, and you might see slight differences if you are using another version. Now that we can successfully access the Azure SQL Database Server instance in the cloud, we can move our Dynamics NAV database to it. In SQL Server Management Studio, connect to the local instance of SQL Server and view your NAV database. Before proceeding to move a database to Azure, it is necessary to remove any Windows authenticated users inside the database, as these will cause a failure of the transfer process. For example, NT authority /network service. Check if any Windows users exist in your NAV database and remove them using SQL Server Management Studio. Now we are ready to move the database to Azure. Right-click on the NAV database and select Tasks, then Deploy Database to Windows Azure SQL Database, as shown here to start the deployment wizard. Click Next when the introduction window appears in order to move to the Deployment Settings window. Click on the Connect button for the target connection. And when prompted for a server name, paste the Azure SQL Database connection string which you established a moment ago. Set the authentication to SQL Server Authentication and provide the login and password which you specified in Azure when you created the SQL database instance earlier in this process. Then click Connect to save the above details and return to the Deployment Wizard window. Note that if you see the value Web or Business for the edition of Windows Azure SQL Database, then change it to Standard, as Web and Business are no longer valid options. Verify that the other settings are as shown here and click Next to go to the Summary window. On the Summary window, click Finish to proceed with the operation to move the NAV database to your Azure SQL Database instance. A progress window will appear. When the process is complete, you should see that all steps have succeeded. At this stage, we have successfully created a copy of the Dynamics NAV database in our Azure Database Server instance, and this can be viewed directly in SQL Server Management Studio. You can also see the database on the Azure portal. Of course, the Dynamics NAV middle tier and clients are still using the database on the Azure VM, so we have some more steps to follow to configure the NAV environment so that it is actually using the Azure SQL database that we have just created. The next demo in this video shows how to configure the Microsoft Dynamics NAV middle tier to use the Azure SQL database. Because the Dynamics NAV middle tier environment is on an Azure VM, it is necessary to open an endpoint for port 7046 of the VM so that the Azure hosted middle tier can provide client services to NAV clients outside of Azure. Using the Azure portal, select the relevant VM which is running the NAV middle tier service, and then click on Endpoints. At the bottom of the page, click on the Add button. On the next page, select Add a standalone endpoint, and then click on the arrow to go to the next page. Next, specify the details shown here for the endpoint, and then click on the checkbox on the bottom right to save the new endpoint. This slide shows the tasks we need to perform in order to configure the Dynamics NAV middle tier so that it accesses the NAV database on the Azure SQL database server rather than on the on-premise version of SQL Server. The easiest way to do this is to run scripted PowerShell commandlets, which can be copied and pasted from the blog, which is available at the URL shown at the bottom of this slide. First, start the PowerShell ISC environment on your Azure VM as administrator. Then paste the PowerShell commandlets I mentioned earlier into the upper pane of the PowerShell ISE. It will be necessary to modify this script to use the correct values for your own environment. First, we will need to import the NAV administration commandlets, and also to install the Net HTTP activation Windows feature. We next need to create a key to encrypt the credentials stored in the NAV service tier configuration file. For this, you need to make sure that the key path already exists, and you need to add in the correct password. Next, we need to import the key into the NAV server instance. Before running this commandlet, make sure that the values provided match your environment. Next, we need to add database credentials to the NAV service tier configuration file. The next two commandlets redirect the NAV service tier to use the Azure SQL database for NAV. This commandlet enables encryption. Next, we need to restart the NAV service tier to pick up the new settings. And finally, we need to import the NAV license file into the Azure SQL database. After running these commandlets, the NAV service tier is using the NAV database on the Azure SQL database server, so the on-premise NAV database is no longer required. I have demonstrated this by shutting down the on-premise version of SQL Server, which used to run the NAV database, and starting the NAV Windows client on the Azure VM so that you can see it successfully starts when using the Azure SQL database. Also, if we look inside the NAV service tier configuration file, we can see how the Azure SQL database login credentials are encrypted. In the next part of this video, I will show how we can use the Dynamics NAV web client on my laptop to connect to the NAV web server, which is running on our Azure VM, which is in turn configured to use the NAV Azure SQL database. The NAV web service components are already installed on our Azure VM, which we can verify by simply starting the NAV web client directly on that machine. However, before trying to open the NAV web client on my own laptop, I will need to open an endpoint for port 8080 for our Azure VM to allow an on-premise NAV web client to access the NAV web service on that machine. I can do this on the Azure portal by selecting our VM and then opening the Endpoints configuration option. Once in the endpoint configuration page, I select the Add option at the bottom of the page to create a new endpoint. Now I select the Add a standalone endpoint option followed by the arrow button to move to the next page. On the next page, I need to specify these options followed by the check mark in order to add the endpoint as required. After a moment, the endpoint will be available on the Azure VM. We are now almost ready to connect to the web server on the Azure VM from my on-premise laptop. My browser normally runs in the security context of my Windows login, which is a domain account. However, the NAV middle tier service is running in an Azure VM, which does not recognize my credentials. Therefore, I will have to run my browser with credentials that match a Windows login on the NAV middle tier machine. For the purposes of this demo, I have created a local machine account on my Azure VM called NAV admin. I will now create a Windows local machine account on my laptop using the same login name and a matching password. I can now run my browser on my laptop using the local machine account, which matches a local machine account on the Azure VM, which also has a matching password. This will ensure that my browser will run with the right credentials on the Azure VM. If you have any problems accessing the NAV web service on the Azure VM, then make sure that port 8080 is open on the Windows firewall via Control Panel while logged into Windows on the Azure VM. After a moment, the web client starts as expected, accessing our NAV database on the Azure SQL database server. Let's review what we have seen during this video. First, we uploaded the Dynamics NAV database from an on-premise version of SQL Server into Azure SQL database. Next, we configured the Dynamics NAV middle tier service on our Azure VM so that it accesses the NAV database, which we have placed into the Azure SQL Server. Finally, we ran the NAV web client from a browser on my laptop to access the NAV database on the Azure SQL database server. We have now completed the steps for this video, demonstrating how to set up Microsoft Dynamics NAV to work on an Azure SQL database instance. I hope you have found the information useful and wish you well as you leverage the Azure SQL database server for your Microsoft Dynamics NAV deployments.